How's it going, guys? AnxiousCynic back again with another Blender tutorial, and this is probably going to conclude the Minecraft animation tutorial series for Blender here. And what we're going to get into today is compositing and getting set up for your final render in Blender. So to make this easier for us, I'm going to go ahead and come out of the default view and go into the compositing view. Once again, this is all highly customizable and you can get any of this stuff anywhere, even from the default view that you want, but we're just using these to make our lives a little easier. So what we have here is, this is the node editor. You may recall from a couple of episodes ago, we went into that briefly. And this is what we're going to use to do some compositing effects on our animation. So the first thing we're going to want to do is render a frame out of our animation, and for now I'm going to turn off motion blur because we don't want that just yet. So let's see what we can get here. So I'm going to go ahead and render. Alright, there we go. There's our render, and as you can see, it's a pretty decent looking scene. It doesn't look too bad except for some of the noise and fireflies we have in there. But what we want to do is actually be able to composite some stuff now. So I'm going to hit N on my keyboard to get rid of that side panel there because I don't want it right now. And we're going to come down here to this button and click Use Nodes, and then as you see we get these two nodes here. So this might be a little bit daunting to start off with, but it's pretty simple. We're only going to be doing some pretty basic stuff here. It may seem complicated, but once you kind of get into it a little bit, it's not going to be too bad. So I'm just going to grab that node and drag it over, make up some room here. And as you can see, we have this Z, speed, and mist, and these are some of the options that we turn on in our render layers section in the first episode, if you recall, under the passes. So we have these available to us now in the compositor. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and set up our mist, or like the fog you might normally see in Minecraft. So I'm going to hit the Shift A key, and that brings up our add menu. Alternatively, you can come down here and click add and go to these here. But of course, if I hit Shift A, I'll bring that up, and I'm just going to click on search, and we want to bring in a mix node. So I'm going to type in mix, and that's the only option available. So I'm going to hit enter, and then we get this, and it's already like selected on our mouse. So I'm just going to click to set it in there. And this is basically what we're going to use to bring our mist into the final render. And you can watch this down here. Another thing I can do is actually bring it into this window. So if I hit Shift A, go to search, and I'm going to hit viewer, or spell out viewer. This is a viewer node. You'll see composite here. This is our final image, what we're going to actually be rendering. And viewer node actually brings it in. Let's go ahead and detach that. So I just clicked and dragged that noodle, as they're called, over there. And then I can click this, use backdrop, and that'll put the image in there. So there's a few reasons I guess you might want to do this. I don't really find it that particularly helpful to me, but that's the way you can do it. Anyway, now we want to go ahead and set this up. So if I go ahead and drag this over, I'm going to drag it to the factor of our mix, and you'll see that this is gray and that's gray, the little node nodule thing there. And if I bring this out, let's go ahead and plug it into our composite. You'll see that changes down there, and if I bring it over here, this changes here. So what we're going to do, obviously, is bring our image down because we got rid of that with the way I just did it, and now you'll see that we have our image back, and there's some fog back there. All right, so we have the fog back there. This isn't really the best angle to show this. I might change the angle in a second, but we're just going to go over some of these basics real quick before we do. But you can see that that turned into fog back there. So just to compare here, let's go ahead and drag this back over to this one. And you'll see here we have the fog, and then down here, it's not there anymore. Let's see if we can actually reverse that. And we'll do like so. And yeah, you can see down here we have the fog in the background. This one doesn't. And maybe we'll want that the other way around. All right, so what I'm going to do from this point on is I'm going to have this one up here show what we have going on with our nodes, and this one is going to be just the default render. As you can see, I have it just going straight over to that. And yeah. So what we want to do is we can actually change the color of our fog by clicking on this little icon here. I can bring it up and drag around and change the color. We can't see it. It's actually blocking the only spot we have that from. So let's go ahead and bring this over. And there, I can drag it, and you'll see it makes it red. Yeah, I can do any number of things that I want to do. Usually Minecraft is kind of a little bit of a light blue, I guess. So I'm just going to leave it right about there, and you can also change the brightness of it by clicking and dragging on this little bar here. And whatnot. I'm just going to leave it at full brightness so we can kind of see what we're doing. So there's a couple of more things that you can do to adjust this. One is we can come over here to our world tab, and you'll notice that down here we have the mist pass, and you can change the depth of it. And you're not going to really see a whole lot of difference here because of this angle we have. When I change it in a moment, maybe we'll be able to see something a little bit better. But this is what you would use to kind of change the density and I guess maybe the distance of the fog a little bit and whatnot. We'll get to that in a moment. But another thing that we can do is over here in our nodes, I'm going to hit Shift A, and I'm going to go to search, and we want to go to map value. I'm going to use my arrow keys to go up and down, and I'm going to hit enter and bring that in, and I'm going to drop this actually right in here between these two, and it'll automatically connect. And that'll allow us to kind of change some of the effects of the fog right here in the node editor. I haven't played with this a whole lot, so I don't really know exactly, what the best settings are. It probably depends on your scene, but I'm just going to bump this down to about 0.7, and you'll see back there it kind of made the fog a little bit less dense and noticeable. So I'm just going to leave that like so. I'm going to zoom out with my mouse wheel here. And yeah, that's pretty good there. That's about what we want. And let me see if I can change the angle, and I'll make a new render, and we'll see if we can show a little bit more of what this does. All right, guys, so we got our new render here, and as you can see, there's more distance between Steve and the house, so we get to see a little bit more of what the fog's doing. Looks pretty cool, I would have to say. That doesn't look too bad in the original, but, we got this going on, so it's not too bad. And if I change the depth over here, though, let's just say I bring it up to, say, 50, that's not going to show immediately because that's something that we would have to re-render. That's a setting that's taking place within our scene, and thus we would have to render it to see the actual benefits of changing that. You can play around with that yourself, and for sake of saving time and not having to do a bunch of renders for this tutorial, I'm just going to leave it at default and not worry too much about it for now. But you can play with that and see what kind of results you get for it yourself. The next thing we want to do, though, is motion blur. So there's a couple of ways we could do this. As I said before, you can do it the way that I showed before in the render tab by toggling on motion blur. Personally, I'm going to go ahead and say I think that's my preferred method, but if for some reason you can't do it or you don't want to or whatever, we're going to show how to do that with the node setup here, since we have those options available to us from our original setup tutorial. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and hit Shift A, and I'm going to search, and I'm going to hit vector, or type in vector, and we have vector blur, and I'm going to bring that in by clicking on it, and I'm going to drag this right here. As you can see, this noodle turns orange, and when I let go of it or I click on it, it sets it in there and brings that right into place, and it's good. And you'll notice here on this one we have samples and we have blur, and you can change this. I think the higher the samples, then the higher the quality the blur is. And then the blur setting here, I think you can raise or lower to determine just how much is blurred by the compositor. So let's see if we drag this way up. Maybe give it 50. We probably need a better scene here in order to really show how this is working, because there's not a lot of fast movement here. So let me go ahead and do that real quick, and see what we can get done here. All right, guys, so this is our new render where I made Steve move his arm over kind of quickly, and we'll see what that looks like. So now that we've got this in place and I have these bumped up, let's actually return that back to normal. What was it? I think it was 32. Let's just have that kind of be default again. So what we need to do now that this is in, we basically have our image coming out. It's going to our mix node, and we have our mist coming out as being affected by our map value, and then going into our mix node. So it's basically saying, take this image, mix it with that mist value. Now we're going into the vector blur with the image, and then out to this viewer node so we can see what we're doing. And it's basically just passing the image through all of these nodes. You can kind of consider them filters, basically. And so that's what we have going on there. But now we need to tell Blender, well, how do you read how fast things are going and what are they doing? And you may notice here that we have this Z and speed, and the same thing on our renders layer. So I'm just going to grab those and drag them over to the corresponding part. And I'm going to just drag this down. Doesn't really matter, but we're just going to get it out of the way and do like so. And then now you'll see here that we're getting some motion blur. And let's see if we can bump up our samples. Let's go to 50 for that. And as you can see, some of those lines in our motion blur has changed. Let's bump this down to 20. And you'll see you have these weird little jittery lines here. And so if I go up to say 80, then you should get this nice smooth blur there, and that looks pretty good. And then if I bump this, say 1.5, then you can see we get a different quality of blur there, maybe 1.5, and see what that looks like. And you can see that gets much more blurry. So those are basically the things that you can do to get that motion blur look there, and that's pretty much all done in compositing. So pretty much that means that everything will render and there's no motion blur in the original render or anything like that, and then these nodes apply those effects to the animation afterwards. And generally this is meant to, I think, save render time, because Blender can be pretty slow at rendering, and you want to save as much time as possible. So rather than having that information render with your animation, you can just have it apply afterwards. So one more touch we may want to go over with our nodes here is something that I've played with. I don't really know how necessary it is, but we're just going to mess with it for now and see if we can get a good look out of it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift A to bring up the search, and I'm going to type in glare. I'm going to hit enter, and this is our glare node. So as you can see, I set that in there and it went into this noodle here, but we don't want that per se. So what I'm going to do is hit Shift A and bring up another mix node. So I'm going to hit that and bring it in. I'm going to place it right here. And basically what I want to do is I'm going to drag this down to our mix node, and I'm going to hit it in there. So now we have the image coming out going to the glare, and then over here to this mix node. And then we're going to take this and bring it out to our viewer. And remember, we're only affecting this one. If we rendered our final image, this would not be what we want to do. We want it going to the composite node here, but that's something we'll do in a moment. So the reason I brought in this new mix node is because you can't have two of these plugged into the composite or viewer node at once. So what you do is you bring in a mix node, and then that way you can bring both of these together. And now all it takes is this one to go out. It mixes those two signals together basically, and then you get the final image out the end. I hope that makes sense. Once again, I highly recommend watching like Born CG's, Blender tutorials or whatnot to understand this stuff better. So what I want to do here, I'm going to go back up to our glare node. Let's zoom in here so we can see a little bit better. I'm going to change this from streaks to fog glow, and I'm going to turn up our quality to high. Again, I'm not really sure how much of a difference all that makes, but this is just what I've played around with. What I'm going to do is go ahead and bump up our mix to, let's just say 0.5. And then we should see a little bit of a result from that here in a moment. And now we're going to go to threshold. I'm going to turn that down to 0. And I'm going to take our size and bring it down as well. You'll notice down here, we're actually getting our glare effect because this is going to our composite node, which is this image down here. So you can kind of see what the glare is doing by itself. And on our final render here, or technically what will be our final render once we set this all up, we have it looking a little bit different because we have these other effects applied. So let's go ahead and change this mix node though to an add node, and you'll see a little bit of a difference there. Boom! As you can see, that glare node kind of gives things a little bit of a glare look, as you might imagine. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this up from the add node to the composite node so that we'll get the same effect on both images, and that way we can see it a little more clearly down there. As you can see, you get this kind of just a little bit more imperfect look. It looks like things are kind of, light is bouncing off of things, and you just, I don't know. It depends on if you want it or not, but to me, it generally has a more pleasing effect. And you can adjust. Let's actually bring the size down to 6. I thought I did that already. Let's bring that down. And as you can see there, that kind of takes some of that washiness out of it, but you get the glare on some of the brighter areas. So I generally use about these settings just in my practice. I haven't really made anything with this, so I don't know how that would change. But that's basically how I would set up something, at least in the beginning, to see what that would do for me. So the last thing I want to do here with our node comparison, at least, is if you notice down here, our render time was 55.2 seconds. And I want to compare that with what it would take to render with actual motion blur from our actual render tab here, and see how that compares in look as well as time to our vector blur. So what I'm going to do is go down here to our render area, and you'll see down here it says slot 1. I'm going to go up to slot 2. I have a previous render on that, so don't worry about that. It would be blank. It would look like, if I go to slot 3, you'll see there it would look like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this vector blur real quick. I'm just going to detach that like so and bring this up here. So we're basically just mixing the glare and the fog, and we're not getting the Let's go back to 1 so we can see what that's doing. I may have to turn this off and back on. There we go. So we're not getting the blur anymore. You'll see that that's solid. All right, so I'm going to go back to 2. I'm going to turn on our motion blur, and remember we set it down to 0.1. That may differ depending on what kind of scene you're shooting. I'm going to re-render this and see how long it takes to render, as well as how that look compares to the vector blur. Alright guys, so our render is done, and as you can see, we've got some decent blur there. Personally, I don't know. I kind of feel like this looks better to me, and our render time was 58 seconds. So it does add a little bit more, but, you know, depending on the scene you're shooting and all this kind of stuff, it may be more or less negligible. For myself, I would probably want to try to use this unless it just became too burdensome, but that's what you get with the built-in motion blur, and of course set to the setting that I have it on. It would probably be different if I upped that or lowered it. So just keep that in mind. And that's just basically a little comparison for you to hopefully help you make your decisions. All right, so I'm going to come back out to default view so we can see what's going on here. I'm going to go to 0 so we can see the camera view. Not that that's important, but that's what I'm going to do. And finally, we want to just go over some of our render settings. You may notice, let's actually go to our render. I'm going to come over here and change our type to UV/image editor. And this is our view for our dang old renders. And there's the first one without any motion blur, and there's the second one with motion blur. As you can see, that's the one that has the built-in like render motion blur. And what I want to do is come over here to our render settings. So first of all, I'm rendering at 40% of 1920 by 1080. That's one of the reasons our render time is so low. If I bump this up to 100%, it would probably take a couple of minutes to render this full image here at full resolution. But what we want to do, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to come down here to our sampling. And of course, we're rendering at 128 samples right now. For a final render, you might would want to bump that up. I've played around with it for anywhere from 250 to 500 to even up to 1,000 to get a quality result. But for this tutorial, we're just going to leave this at 128. But just remember that basically the higher this is, then the better quality render you're going to get. So there's a couple of things that I want to do to help us get a little bit better result. One thing is you'll notice that we have a lot of this noise in here. If you can see that, a lot of noise in that image. And it's static noise. And what that means is actually it's just going to be there as if something was splattered on your lens. And one thing you can do to make it where it actually moves and makes it look a little bit more like natural, like film grain, is clicking this little clock looking thing here. And that actually says, like if you look at what it says, use different seed values and hence noise patterns at different frames. So what this does is it randomizes that noise over every frame that you render. So that way the noise isn't just static, like a little still image over your frame. It actually moves like it's kind of like film grain or something. I haven't experimented with that a whole lot. It just generally kind of gives it a little bit more pleasing effect. But what you generally would want to do is have no noise. So, you know, I'll leave that to your discretion. The next thing we want to do, I haven't messed with this very much either, but the clamp indirect, we're going to go ahead and bump this up to 1. And if you notice these little fireflies, as they're called, those little sparkly looking things in the background, that's supposed to help with that. We'll see that in a second. But first, I want to go ahead out of the sampling area, and I'm going to come down here to light paths. And you have these settings here, these bounces and whatnot. And if you recall, by default, our reflective and refractive caustics were on. I turned those off. That's because we're not doing like realistic water or anything like that. So we don't need those. So we can turn them off and save the computer from having to render those things when they're not even present in our animation. But another thing that you can do, I've played around with this and I haven't really noticed that much of a benefit from them, but you can reduce your number of bounces here. So for instance, let's go ahead and have minimum down to 0 and we'll bring maximum to say 4. So technically what this is saying, from my understanding, is your light is going to hit objects and bounce off of them to give you that kind of realistic lighting that you would have in the real world. And this determines how many times those bounces can occur. And as far as I know, you know, obviously the more bounces there are, then the more Blender is having to calculate. So you can turn this down and get almost the same results without the extra cost of render time. So now that we've got those settings done, I'm going to go ahead and go to slot 3 and make a new render and see how that compares to our previous render. And there we go, guys. As you can see there, we actually shaved about 20 seconds off of our render time there. We went from around, what was it, 58 to 38. So there was an improvement in render time, and now you'll see that those fireflies, those nasty little bright spots, are gone, and our image doesn't look too terrible. It does look a bit grainy. We may want to up the bounces or something like that and play around with those, but again, there are more fleshed out tutorials that kind of teach you all that stuff, but this is just the basics that I would try when making my animation. So let's go ahead and take a comparison look real quick, since we went ahead and rendered to a different slot. So I'm going to go back to slot 2, and this is the look we got on slot 2, and this is the look we get on slot 3. So a little bit more noisy, but no more fireflies. Again, though, I highly recommend that you watch, more fleshed out Blender tutorials for the best settings that you can look for all these settings that we've gone over in this tutorial. But that's just what we're going to leave it at for now to give you the basic idea. All right, so let's say that you're done with your animating and your compositing and you're ready to render your final animation. So what you're going to want to do is determine what your final resolution is going to be. And I'm just going to say maybe it's 1920 by 1080. So what you're going to want to do is bring this on up to 100% so that you're rendering the full frame. So now that we've got that set to 100, and we're going to be rendering our entire frame, your output tab down here is telling you what you're going to be rendering to. So right here you have your rendering directory. This is saying where the images are going to be rendered to, and you can click this folder tab and go into the file browser and tell it where you want it to be. And you also have this option here, which is PNG. This is what I think Blender is set to by default. And what that would do if you went up here and clicked the animation button is it's going to render each frame as its own individual image, i.e. a PNG image. And then you can import that into a video editor or whatever and put it all together, or actually re-import it into Blender and do that, because Blender is a video editor and everything all combined. Alternatively, you can click on this and change it. You have other image types. You can save it as a JPEG, and then you have this movie section over here where you can render it as an AVI file or an H.264, etc., etc. Personally, I would recommend you probably just stick with PNG, just render it out as individual images, and that also allows you to render over time. Let's just say you only have enough time to render, say, like 10 frames. What you can do is go to your frame range here and set this to go to 10, so you will only render frame 1 through 10. And since those are individual files, you can do that, and you'll have frame 1 through 10 as an image file. And then the next time you come back, you want to render more. So what you would do is you would come down here and you say, I think I want to start off from frame 11 because I already have 10, and I can render from there to 55, something like that. And you'll notice down here on our timeline that that section is now highlighted. You can see that that's our work area now. And you can do that, and that way you can render parts of your animation over time without having to sit there and watch your computer explode as Blender takes days to render your final animation. Of course, if you don't want to, I just reset this. You can obviously just tell it to render the whole thing at once if you want to let it go overnight, or leave your computer on for days, or whatever you want to do, however long it takes to render your final animation and stuff. So I think that's pretty much it, guys. I hope I covered it all. If I missed anything, feel free to let me know, and maybe we'll do some future tutorials and come back and brush up on some of this stuff. But for now, I think that's going to be it. So I hope this tutorial was helpful. I hope this series has been helpful in getting you started. I've actually learned some things myself just by doing this tutorial series, which is what I was hoping to do. So I hope it taught you even more so than it taught me, though. And yeah, if you want to see more Blender tutorials, like standalone, kind of like what I'm doing for Minimator, feel free to let me know and give me suggestions in the comments and whatnot, and I will see what I can do. Otherwise, that's going to be it for me. So once again, guys, thanks for watching. I really hope this tutorial series has been helpful to you and has kind of helped you get over the dauntingness of Blender and moved on to making some cool stuff of your own. So as always, thanks for watching, guys. If you liked the video, if you found it helpful, then feel free to hit that like button, comment, and subscribe to become a citizen today. Share it with your friends and your family and your pets and all Blender Minecraft animation enthusiasts out there. And yeah, that's going to be it. So I will see you in the next video.